In this video, I'm going to be drawing the dungeon below Castle Moonhold and explaining how to add simple details to your dungeon drawing to create an awesome story. Every month on my Patreon, I release a new tabletop role-playing game zine. Last month, I made a book filled with interesting and weird NPC dragons. Next month, I'm gonna do a little mini campaign, start a mini campaign that is inspired by old NES RPGs. And this month, I'm making a guide all about drawing dungeons. The map I'm making in this video is the example in the book, so if you follow the instructions in the guide, you'll be able to draw a dungeon map that looks just like this. Okay, let's time warp back before I drew the map, and I'll explain how I made it and also my technique for making more story-filled dungeons. Usually I start my dungeon map drawings with a list of rooms and a story already figured out, but this time I just grabbed a sheet of graph paper and started sketching with a pencil. My only ideas going into this map was that it was going to be an actual dungeon under a castle and then also have some cave and cavernous elements thrown in as well. As I was drawing, I started to get ideas for this story of a clan of noble werewolves that live in this stronghold up on a misty cliff. And then I started thinking about all the crazy things that werewolves would have down in their dungeon below their mighty castle. Okay, let's back up. For this map, I'm using just a few tools. I don't really think the tools matter all that much, and you can use whatever you have to make a cool map, but I am using some 1/4-inch graph paper, a regular old mechanical pencil with a white vinyl eraser, and some micron pens. For this map, I'm using a size 3, a 5, and a 10. So after I got my little story idea and the sketch knocked out, I'm jumping straight into inking. I'm using the size 10 micron, which is the thickest pen, to make the outlines of the dungeon. I like using the boldest line to delineate the difference between open spaces like a dungeon room and closed spaces like the underground. Having nice, solid, really thick, bold lines like this is the best way to make your map really stand out. I think this part of the drawing is super fun, and honestly, you can make a really cool looking map with just these outlines. I mean, if you can draw a straight line and a curved line, then you can draw a dungeon. It's really just walls on a grid, right? Well, I guess actually you don't even need a grid, just sketch out a dungeon and ink the walls. It'll look great. But okay, you probably want some doors and maybe some other features in there too, just to spice things up a little bit. And I think you can actually keep things really simple when drawing these extra features and still add a lot of character and environmental design to your dungeon map. So this is a dungeon, but it's also a werewolf dungeon. So there's a bunch of little human-sized holding cells, but there's also a really huge one for holding monsters. There's a feeding pit for dire wolves and even a shrine with a blood fountain. Of course, these werewolves have some secret caves where they can enter and exit through the harbor and a place to stash treasure. There's also a bottomless pit where they dispose of those who refuse to submit to their lupine curse. If you're playing a tabletop role-playing game on a map like this, having simple decorations like some crates or barrels automatically creates story. Of course, these werewolves could have some barrels of wheat or potatoes or something, but what if there's something more sinister inside? Players are absolutely gonna wanna look inside those barrels. And it's the same with other simple stuff like beds. Just adding a little rectangle bed with a little rectangle pillow seems pretty simple, right? But this side room with 3 beds probably means that there's 3 guards down here somewhere, and we've only snuck past 1 so far. Stuff like statues and coffins are all really simple to draw. You can make an easy symbol like a circle with a star in it to indicate the statue. It's evocative, but it still leaves some room for the game master to describe what the players are actually seeing when they enter the room and they look at the statue. Tables and chairs, doors and treasure chests are just squares, rectangles, and circles with a few extra detail lines, and adding in environmental details like slopes and raised areas or even bridges over pits make the dungeon way more fun to explore. Hopefully you can see how adding just a few of these details really goes a long way in describing this place. With not much extra effort, you can take a dungeon from a series of empty hallways to a place that actually feels alive. Now, as far as the actual illustration goes, I like to draw all these features with a smaller pen, the 0.5 micron, to get the thinner and more controllable lines. Plus, it's nice to have a hierarchy of line widths to make the map much easier to look at, especially as I start to add more and more of these details to the drawing. But before moving on to the smaller details, I like to erase my pencils. Sometimes the thinnest lines of the 0.3 micron don't hold up to heavy erasing. Right now, I'm only using the 0.3 pen for the really small stuff like the wood grain on a bookshelf or a treasure chest. I'll come back to the 0.3 and add the grid later, but first I'm gonna jump back up to the 0.5 and add a bunch of texture to the outside of this map. Now, adding this texture might not be totally necessary to make a cool looking dungeon map illustration, but I wanna make it super extra clear that the outside of these thick lined walls is the underground, is the solid earth. Now there's a lot of ways to achieve this. Using color would probably be the easiest, but this map is going to be just line work, solid black and white. And my favorite is to use this hatching texture. Dyson Logos has made this old school look popular again, and I just love it. I'll have a link to their website in the description. This texture is just so fun to draw and it looks great. But the important thing to remember with this crosshatch pattern is to make sure it's not too thick and heavy. The lines of this pattern need to be much thinner than the lines of the walls, otherwise the map won't pop off the page. I also thought it'd be fun to mix up the texture since there's sort of two areas of this dungeon. The stonework areas have the hatching, and the cave areas I'm using some stippling. I really love the way that Paths Peculiar stipples their map, so I thought I'd give replicating that technique a shot here on this map. So stippling is just making little dots over and over again to create a pattern. The more densely packed the dots are, the darker the area gets. It's kind of like you're shading an area but with solid dots. I'm trying to condense the most dots near the cave outlines and then sort of fan them out and make them less dense as the pattern moves away from the dungeon walls. And the cool thing is, if you squint, you can really tell how much the dungeon pops off the page. It's almost like adding a layer of gray underneath the drawing, and it's really exactly the effect I was going for. Okay, so adding these textures are definitely the most tedious part of drawing this dungeon map. I think it's really, really fun doing this stuff though. I go into a sort of Zen mode, zoning out and just thinking my thoughts and enjoying my time at the drawing table. It's like, it's relaxing, but also productive at the same time. I don't know, drawing maps is just so much fun, and if you haven't tried it before, you really should give it a shot. Okay, now it's time for another fun part of this illustration, adding in the grid. For this, I'm going back down to the thinnest pen, the 0.3 micron, and at this point there's a lot of detail happening on this map, so I want to keep these lines nice and thin. You know, I don't want them to compete with the more important details that I use the thicker pen lines on. And since I drew this map on a piece of grid paper, it's really easy to trace over the grid lines. For the stonework areas, I'm making the lines a little more solid, but still letting them be kind of wavy and separated here and there. This is a dungeon, so even though the stones might not really be these huge 5 by 5 foot blocks, by applying this kind of effect, you get that dark and grimy, weathered, worn stonework kind of idea across. You know, if I was drawing the upper floors of the castle that are more pristine and kept up, I might go a little slower and make the grid lines more straight and precise to convey that sort of feeling. And for the cave area, I'm breaking up the grid lines even more. They're all chunked up and separated to differentiate this texture from the one in the rest of the dungeon. Now, hopefully seeing the process of drawing this map gives you the confidence to draw your own. Drawing dungeons is really simple. It just takes some time and patience, and creating a map like this to explore on the game table is It's just so fun and rewarding. If you'd like an actual easy to follow step-by-step guide for drawing dungeons, definitely check out my Patreon. There's a digital tier where if you sign up, you'll get access to the Drawing Dungeons guidebook at the end of the month, as well as access to all of the other guidebooks and adventures that I've made in the past. And there's also a physical tier where once the book is printed, I'll send it directly to your mailbox. I put a ton of work into these zines. I'm really proud of them, and I try to make them as helpful and as useful as possible. So if all of that sounds cool and you want to learn how to draw some dungeon maps, check it out. It's a great way to help out this channel. Okay, let me know what you think of the dungeon below Castle Moonhold down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. See ya!